Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Imagine you were living a real life experience that first wound up in a hit book, then a box office smash, and you'd be walking in the footsteps of the prolific Nicola Kraus, who joins us today to talk about her long term collaboration with Emma McLaughlin that began 2 decades ago, co creating the Nanny Diaries franchise, and has continued for 20 years and bestsellers since. Nicola, thanks so much for taking out time to be with us. To kick things off, please tell us how you and your longtime co-author Emma McLaughlin first met while you were attending NYU together, and were you also nannies at the same time?
Emma and I both transferred into NYU. So we really feel like we were destined to meet because otherwise, why would we have picked the wrong colleges to kick off our careers? We were taking a class called Gender and Performance, which is a very 90s class. And I thought she was a genius. I was convinced that she was consulting in Washington on Mondays and Wednesdays and just coming up for class on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So for the entire semester, I followed her to the elevator every day, and I never got up the courage to talk to her. And then I graduated. And then I was at a Citibank ATM on the corner of 86 and Lexington, and there she was. And like, what are you doing up here? It was very strange to see someone so far out of context. And I said, I live up here and I nanny up here. And she said, I live up here and I nanny up here. And neither of us had ever met another student who was nannying. It's, I think, much more common now, but we were real outliers at the time. That was maybe a Tuesday or a Wednesday. By the weekend, the family that she was nannying for sat her down and said, we're getting a divorce. Oh, that's the unbearable tension I've been feeling all year. And we're giving you 24 hours to vacate your room. So she called me sobbing and I said, move in with me. So we started living together within days of starting talking to each other. And that was over 20 years ago and we've never stopped.
Wow, talk about right place, right time. Once you were living under the same roof, did the Nanny Diaries root out of organic conversation you'd have at night about the respective families you were nannying for?
We would talk about it occasionally, but it wasn't so much therapeutic as just, well, this tedious thing happened or this person isn't paying me. But I promise you, there were way more exciting things to talk about in our 20s than our day jobs. But then after I graduated, and I graduated a year early, I was acting. So I alternated between nannying, which I would do in the mornings, and then I would perform in the evenings and, rinse, repeat. And Emma went on to doing organizational development. Both of us were using the degrees that we'd gotten at NYU working with children, child development. Emma was using it to work with children who were socioeconomically at risk, and I was working with children who were on the autism spectrum. So nothing was wasted. We thought that those degrees were going to help us, and certainly nannying was a chance to put all of that into practice. And then the first summer that we lived together, I introduced her to her now husband. So even though in very typical early 20s fashion, by the end of that summer, we'd stopped speaking, we kept running into each other at parties and we would just talk for hours. And then about 5 years later, I invited her to a reading of a play that I'd written. And she emailed me the next day and said, hey, I'm obsessed with this idea of writing a book about nannying. Would you want to partner with me on it? I'm working such long hours, I can't do it by myself. And I thought, a book about nannying? That sounds like the worst thing ever. It was a horrible job. Who would want to read about it? But I was just reaching a point where had decided not to act anymore. I was starting to do my pre-med requirements. I thought I was going to go to med school, but I was in a very say yes to everything. So I was like, let's do it. And we started working on it together in earnest in January of 2000, and it was a snowball. It just picked up speed and momentum at every turn. The universe really wanted this book to exist. The doors just kept opening for us.
That's an enviable position for any first-time author. Take viewers back to the point in time, if you would, when you were essentially really first sitting down to begin working on the book together, and how it creatively bloomed from there.
Initially, we hadn't even conceived of it as a novel. We thought we were going to write a series of satirical essays. And the first time that we met to work together, we decided we'd start with the interview. And that was the first real conversation we'd ever had about the job. And Emma shared with me her recollections and her impressions, and I had my recollections and my impressions. And the thing that really surprised us just in that first hour was that they matched. And that was our first inkling that not only were my experiences similar enough that this subject was really worthy of attention, But the fact that our experiences were really interchangeable, it's like, oh, it's not just one crazy lady. This is a whole group of crazy ladies. This is a whole community. And the way we decided to create that first chapter was we outlined, the order of events, and then we alternated. So she would do the arrival, I would do the talk in the living room, she would do the tour of the apartment. Over the course of that week, she emailed me her sections. I just slotted them in order. I didn't do any editing or retouching, and you couldn't tell who wrote what. And without any editing, that is the prologue that exists today. We never touched it. And I dare you to figure out where her voice ends and mine begins.
Amazing. Let's take fans back to the creation of the memorable cast of characters from this book, which of course star Nanny Schuster, the Harvard hottie, Mr. and Mrs. X, and Baby Grayer X.
Once we had that prologue, we started to think about who this family would be if we were going to just tell it through one family. Of course, none of the families we worked for were that interesting. We certainly were parts of very large staffs. We certainly had inklings about affairs, but for the most part, it was just heartbreaking, right? The work of that book was making it funny and not just a miserable slog of, the despair of 4-year-olds. So the first thing we had to figure out was the child. And we actually made Greer a boy for pronouns because we realized if we had Nanny and Mrs. X and Greer in the room at the same time and the 4-year-old was a girl, it would just become impossible. So we had a boy for that very reason. And then we loved kids. So Greer came to fruition quite quickly. Emma was really the one who wrote Greer. She channeled him. She had an inkling. She just had a deep sense of him, a deep felt sense. And I was Mrs. X, for better or worse. We both wrote all the characters because we would write alternating scenes. However, I would rewrite Mrs. X's dialogue and she would rewrite Greer's dialogue to get it where it needed to be. I don't know what it says about me that if you stopped me right now and said, what did she just have for lunch? I'm like, I can tell you. I just knew that woman in my bones. But they weren't one family that we worked for. They really were what the book needed them to be. And the reason we called them the X's was because we'd met in a great books program. My father is a rare book dealer. My mother was a librarian. I grew up in a family where books were the religion. They were how we communicated with each other. We had a constant book club going. Books were everything. Stories were everything. So Emma's father is a college professor. So we wanted to make it seem like it was a real family. And that's why we called them the X's. We were sort of following in that Dickensian, Victorian, satirical tradition through the 1900s. And so to us, it was a very clever literary device, but people took it very literally. And they really thought that we actually had worked for that one family and that this was really our diary. Our first agent suggested to us that we should have a boyfriend in the building. And we thought that was the most absurd thing that we had ever heard because there was no boyfriend in the building. There was no interest. There was no flirtation. There weren't cell phones. Can we explain what this job was? It was just you and the kid and Play-Doh for 8 hours. But we started to think about it, and I had grown up in New York City. I actually grew up on Park Avenue, and I knew those New York City boys. And Emma had been here since she'd arrived to go to NYU, and we were really fascinated by the dance of who boys like Greer become. And we also were very interested structurally in counterpoints, which is why we created the character of Grandma, who is nothing like either of our grandmothers. But we wanted to show a wealthy person who was enjoying their life, who was using their money for good. So that's why we created Grandma. See, we made choices as writers. And then we thought, well, it would actually be interesting to have a boy in the building from the kind of family that I had grown up alongside. The moms covered in golden retriever hair, the parents who were really hands-on, even if the fathers worked in banking. That kind of family really existed in New York in the 80s and early 90s, and then it disappeared. And so that's what HH represented. But then it allowed us to have his friends to show sort of the future for the boys who have childhoods more similar to Greer's.
Thanks for separating that important note of fact from fiction. As you continued working through the book, when did the idea first hit you to have that now legendary nanny cam tirade that became so important to the sequel?
The nanny cam came into play on the last hour of the last day of writing. And by that, I mean, we were heading into copy editing. This was being torn out of our hands, and the book still didn't have an ending. We wanted to have what Emma calls the rant. It was really important to us, and it was important to the structure of the book, right? The air builds and builds and builds and builds in the balloon, and the reader is dying for Nanny to say all the things that we certainly never did. And the challenge was figuring out how to work that in a way that was believable. And there were a couple of aha moments. One was I said to Emma, we have to let Nanny be braver than we were. She went, oh, and then she realized that while Nanny still wouldn't say that to Mrs. X's face, we had to let her say it to something other than, a diary or like shouting it into a pillow. So, or it couldn't be a dream sequence. It had to feel real. Then the second component was that we worked out a formula that we've used in all our other books and that I frequently recommend to clients who are writing in the same genre, which we call the Gandhi, the rant, and the heartbreak. And we feel that if you're writing in this genre, your ending has to have all three elements. So you need the rant, right? You need truth to power and you suck to work for. But then you need Gandhi, right? She erases the tape, or she thinks she's erased the tape. And what she says is, you are so lucky to have this little boy in your life. And I wish for you the opportunity to connect with him the way I have. And the heartbreak, which is goodbye. And if you have all three elements, then it works. And the thing that allowed us to do the nanny cam was they'd just been invented. I don't even think people really had them when we started working on the book. It was something that was just starting to be advertised. And it was Emma's idea. She said, what about this weird teddy bear thing people are using? And we're like, great. And we did it like in an hour. We were just, typing furiously and we're like, okay, done. We can let this go. We can let this go out in the world now.
Talk about creative carpe diem. When you reached the moment where it finally had, how quickly did things take off from there?
The trajectory with Nanny Diaries was incredibly unusual. It was similar to being discovered sitting at Schrafft's in Hollywood in the 30s. We got an agent before we'd written a word. We had written a little proposal letter and the prologue, and Emma's cubicle mate's mom worked in publishing. She took a look at it and said, I know an agent who I think could be really interested in this. We met with that agent. She'd been a nanny. She totally got it. We signed with her. We went off and wrote a few more chapters and a really detailed 26-page outline. And then there were 9 companies that were interested. And on the final day of the auction, 8 of them passed. And not just passed, but passed and told us we were horrible people. And they hoped that we died a very slow and painful death. They were like, I'm on the board at that school. I live in that building. Like, wow, it's very revealing rejection. Okay. And then St. Martin's offered us $25,000 and a hardcover printing. And it was more money than either of us had made in our lifetime. We were just like, we're rich. We can live off this forever. And we were very young and we had very little needs. We're like, pizza for years. And so we finished the book in May of 2001. And at that point, they said it was going to come out in March of 2002. And that seemed forever away.
Well, as you know now, it's not in the publishing world. But you had something that tied you over with the sudden movie offers that kept coming in during that waiting period.
A couple of weeks after delivering the manuscript, I am sitting at home one night and my phone starts ringing. And I'm ignoring it. I go and start playing the messages. And hi, this is Richard Gladstein at the Weinstein Company. I'd like to make Nanny Diaries into a movie. Call me back. This other woman left a message. Hi, I'm the agent representing Nanny Diaries. What? Who are you? I've never talked to you in my life. Harvey has set a 20-minute clock. You have 20 minutes to say whether or not the Miramax can buy it. And now I had worked in development between graduation and this time in my life. And I said, yeah, okay, Harvey can cool it. if he wants it now, he's going to want it in 45 minutes or even 2 weeks from now. Emma's on her honeymoon. I can't say yes to anything without getting a hold of her. Give me a minute. A few hours later, that had completely freaked him out, and we'd sold the film rights. He just, on his own, without us even negotiating, just kept raising the offer. And boom, a year before the book came out. And then we sold the UK rights. And then I went to England before the book came out. I was there visiting family, and I decided to stop by Penguin and just say hello to our editor. And it was the first time I ever heard the phrase chicklet.
I'm curious how freeing or constraining it might have been after the smash success of the first book to follow it up when you began writing your second, Citizen Girl.
At the time, I thought, oh, that's so clever, like the gum, chicklet. Oh, that's adorable. I mean, it's like seeing a gremlin being like, they're so cute. I had no idea what was about to be unleashed. By the time we were doing Citizen Girl, our second book, just trying to get a cover that wasn't pink. Not only that, but very quickly, the parameters of what women could write about shrunk down to really shopping and getting the guy. It was so insulting. It did leverage us as a financial force in publishing, but it was it was golden handcuffs, definitely. And since Emma and I were neither interested in getting the guy nor shopping, trying to write against the wave of chicklet over the next few years was a big, big challenge for us. But the experience of the book actually coming out, we ended up being incredibly blessed by our pub date, because September 11th happened and nobody wanted to buy anything, do anything, go anywhere, or talk about anything for months and months and months. And by March, that was just beginning to shift. And this was really the first thing to capture the cultural zeitgeist, because I think it was fluffy enough and humorous enough to be entertaining and distracting, but there was the substantive conversation about white collar child neglect, about how we treat our health. It was the perfect topic for the media. And so we were suddenly, with no warning, on television every day for months. It was insane. And we were 27 years old. We were absolutely, we didn't come up for air for months.
Wow, well, that's quite a wild ride for any first-time author. Traveling back in time, who were some of the first authors that really enchanted you with reading?
I was always reading. It was a wonderful escape. In the summers, I would just hole up. As you can imagine, I was not a terribly athletic child, but give me a book and a bar of chocolate and a couch, and I would be happy all day. And I was always writing, but because books were held in such high esteem in my family, it just never occurred to me I could be a writer. Actor, sure, that seemed like a completely reasonable career proposition, but writer, like, I could be an astronaut. And in my early 20s, over the years that I was acting, when I would, every 6 months sob uncontrollably, my parents would always say to me, "Oh, Pixie, you should be a writer." I'm like, that's not helpful. That's not a real job. And so when this started to happen, it felt very aligned, and my parents were unbelievably thrilled for me. And I think the way that I was able to make that shift is, there were two authors really. It was Helen Fielding, for starters. My father's English, and I was given a copy of Bridget Jones's Diary a couple of years before it came out here. And I thought it was the most brilliant, revelatory thing I'd ever read, because I'd never seen a woman's interior life on the page in that way. And it was an absolute revelation. And I thought, oh, so writing doesn't just have to be Toni Morrison. It doesn't have to be Pat Barker. It doesn't have to be World War I. It could be, I really want a sandwich, but I'm going to have a salad. Like, that could also be writing. And then David Sedaris, Christmas on Ice, Santaland, Macy's Santaland, was, if you just describe all the asaholic behavior going on around you, that is also writing. So those two things, I think, were very big touch points for Emma and for myself.
And I have to imagine your father being an antiques book dealer. That must have been a wonderland for a kid whose chosen escape was reading.
Oh, yes. My sister and I frequently joke. I mean, we grew up in a bookstore. If I walk into a rare bookstore now, or just a used bookstore, the smell of the paper It is very specific. It is very Proustian for me. And because my father was always looking for books, our vacations were just bookstore to bookstore. My mother would take us for ice cream, then we'd come back to the bookstore. Thankfully, a lot of them in the 80s sold paper dolls, so that was a big way that I would distract myself. But we spent so much time with book people, and book people are very specific people. You know, they're a little bit from the Shire, they're a little bit myopic. My grandmother used to say of my father, you know, I think if I had a spine and a title page, he'd notice me. You know, it's just, you're very single-mindedly focused, and books are really all you care about. And I think that is also true of many, many authors that I've met. You know, we live in a realm that is not entirely here all the time, which can drive my family a little bonkers.
Within the shelves of your father's own bookstore and on the road looking for books at these different town bookshops, who were some of the authors as you continued to get older that continued to make you love reading more and more?
I distinctly remember the summer that I turned 13 or 14, I decided I was going to read all of Agatha Christie's books in one summer. So I did one a day, every day, which was an amazing crash course in plot and pacing and characterization. That was a great summer. Then I went through a big Woody Allen phase, which I know we can't really sing anymore, but you know, I think it's kind of cute in a seventh grader. So that was also a wonderful entree into absurdity, and I love absurdity. Then the people who use language in ways that I just adore, Weird Al Yankovic, huge influence on me. I know that's not a book, but I love the ability to just take something and shift the shading just slightly, and now you have a completely different thing. And the math of that, you know, it takes an extraordinary skill and discipline. And then I'm trying to think of the books where they just absolutely changed my life. I mean, I think I mentioned one of them earlier, Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy. I just thought was the most extraordinary book. I Know This Much Is True, Wally Lamb. Memoirs of a Geisha was so wonderful. I got to meet him and hear him speak and talk about the 10 years and 3 different versions of that book, which is something that I hold dear in my heart when a project is taking longer than I want it to. I just think of him and the 10 years that took. And most recently, I think the book that I was just most swept away by was A Gentleman in Moscow, Amor Towles. It was the perfect book for lockdown. It really nailed it, what it is to be in a beautiful, beautiful place that you can't leave for years at a time. But I love books that are, I mean, I read a lot of historical fiction. I think also that harkens back to my father being English and reading a lot of English fiction as well. They're obsessed with World War I and World War II. So if that's your topic, that's definitely the place to go looking. And then you know, the books that I read as a child, I mean, they were, you know, it was Nancy Drew. It was nothing revelatory or unusual or off the beaten path. You know, I was really I devoured Sweet Valley High. I just was dying to know what adulthood was going to look like, and I was galloping toward it by Lois Lowry. I mean, she's an extraordinary writer, and Judy Blume, of course.
How did that expand outward once you started attending the Gallatin School of Individual Study?
I do want to add also that I started my college career at Brown University, where I could not get into a creative writing class, and they told me I just did not have what it took. So any of you out there who've been rejected from a creative writing class, take that to heart. I took a class with a man named Chris Spain, and one of the many wonderful things about lockdown last year is I took the time to send him a letter. Like, I'm going to find Chris Spain online. It was a small class in creative writing, but he said something that stayed with me all these years, which boiled down to don't throw a brick through the wall that you're building. And he talked about the opening of a Michael Crichton book and how it was driving rain. And he spends paragraphs describing the driving rain. And then a couple of paragraphs later, a character on the tarmac and the helicopter pilot lock eyes. He's like, no, you just spent paragraphs convincing me there's driving rain. And it's a silly little example, but I think of it all the time, and it's something that I am constantly reminding people of in terms of creating contradictions. Now, in terms of people's behavior, one of the most delicious things is that we're incredibly contradictory. So those are wonderful contradictions. But if you're trying to build the world and have the reader hold certain given facts in their head, and then you go ahead and just punch right through that, well, you've broken the egg.
What a wonderful lesson. By the time the Nanny Diaries had made you and your co author household names and you were heading into the writing of Citizen Girl, what was the driving inspiration behind that project?
As far as Citizen Girl, so Emma had been working for a .com where she had been in charge of hiring everyone and then firing everyone. And we were really obsessed with the cowboy culture of that sort of the .com bubble, but also culturally the beginning of the war after September 11th. It was very similar. It had echoes of the World War II in terms of the pinup. Hooters had an airline, cake parties. There was this third wave feminism, Girls Gone Wild. Let's take female sexuality, repackage it, sell it back as feminism, even though it's still just a girl in a thong. And Emma and I really wanted to write a book about that because we felt that there had been so much momentum and energy and excitement around feminism in college. And then as soon as we got out into the real world, we were just exhausted. So our peer group was putting up with things that we never imagined as undergraduates who would. What did you put up with? Well, 20 years later, there was a little thing called the Me Too movement. See that? All of that. That was everything that was happening to us. I was leaving acting because I didn't want to have a man sit across from me when I was auditioning to play a nun and ask me to take my clothes off for the 300th time. We were just done. But it just became the weather. And it was exhausting and demoralizing. And so we felt that given the extraordinary blessing of what our first book had been, we now had a platform and an opportunity to talk about the next thing that was wildly important to us. And that was being young and female and voiceless. And that's Girl. And she still sells wonderfully to this day. It's so sweet. And Emma recently met a young woman who works for the FBI who took her aside and said, I work for the FBI because of Citizen Girl.
That's awesome.
Great. We don't need to send a single copy. We did that.
You two have remained such brilliant observationalist writers throughout your career, taking what's going on in pop culture around the millennium and making it uniquely accessible on the page. How did you do that with the record business and Dedication? Who first came up with that idea?
So Dedication was our third book. Yes? I'm very impressed with your research. So Dedication was our third book, and it's about a young woman whose high school boyfriend disappears right before the prom, and he resurfaces a couple of years later as the #1 pop star on the planet. And every song that he is globally famous for is about her and their high school relationship. And she finally gets a call at 30 that he's come back to their hometown of Croton, Vermont, and she gets on a plane in her pajamas to say, knock it off. And then every other chapter goes back in time to show their relationship from 6th grade through 12th grade. And I am adapting it for film right now. So it is no longer in the distant past for me. I've been living, breathing with Jake and Kate every day now for months. And I have always been fascinated by artists and their muse. And it's interesting, I've been hearing lately in work that I've been interested in, like I was just listening to Just Kids and Patti Smith. She talks about something similar, that as a young woman, we go to museums or we listen to music and all we could aspire to was to be the muse. Like, how do I get into a museum? Take my clothes off. And then we grow up and realize, no, we can make our own art. We can be our own muses, or some young man could be the muse for us. And so I was interested in sort of the interplay between Jake and Kate and what it is to be in that role when you haven't even asked for it as a young woman. It's flattering and it's amazing and you're iconic and you're immortal. And yet there's also tremendous downsides. And I think that those downsides have only heightened in the world that we live in now as privacy continues to erode and in the world of social media, to be Layla or to be Sting's ex-wife, for whom he wrote Every Breath You Take. So I was really, it played into all my obsessions.
The smash box office success of the Nanny Diaries, which starred Scarlett Johansson, Chris Evans, Paul Giamatti, and Alicia Keys, among others, then opened the door for the sequel, The Nanny Returns, 11 years later. Were there initial plans for a sequel?
No, vehemently the opposite.
Oh, really? Out of curiosity, what motivated you and Emma to come back to the table? A big advance, obviously, from a publisher always helps.
It always helps, when you're two people splitting anything. But we had to have enough time pass for us to even entertain the idea of Greer getting older. And then it was Emma's idea, actually, to have the nanny cam be our point of reentry. And the other thing that we were fascinated by, funnily, forget, it wasn't so much fascinated by as invented. I'm going to take that back. It's the first. So one of the things that, all right, sorry.
It's okay. We can edit. I'll start with the edit of what you're happy with. Take your time. There's no rush.
So there was a chain of cause and effect that started with Nanny Diaries and ended with Nanny Returns. What we call white-collar child neglect was incredibly prevalent when Emma and I were nannies. For example, we did all the pediatrician appointments. We bought all the children's clothes. The whole idea of helicopter parenting didn't exist because women didn't ask other women about their children. There was no currency to it. And then our book actually kicked off a shift where there became this one-upmanship on how much micromanaging you were doing of your children. And we were writing about this new wealth that was in New York City, which had not existed. It was a post-Giuliani wealth. When I grew up in the city, I grew up on Park Avenue in a building that had graffiti on the side and a keyed elevator. Very different. My parents would take me downtown on the weekends to art openings. And Mom would be like, just step over the gentleman, just step over the needles, just step over the needles, girls. That was New York, and it was great, and that's what I grew up with. But suddenly, with his broken windows policy, the city got very clean, very Disneyfied, some people call it, very, very affluent. And it no longer became the case that if you worked in a certain strata of the city, you left to have children. People were staying. And so there was this wealth, and then there was this helicopter parenting, and then there was this shift that happened on the academic front. I went to a school called Chapin on the Upper East Side. And when I went there, the parents were afraid of the administration. The administration and the board of trustees had all the status. And your child could be kicked out. Your child needed to behave. Everyone needed to follow the rules. And then what happened with this wealth explosion was that you now had people who were treating the schools like employees. And they were saying, well, no one tells me what to do. And certainly no one tells my kid what to do. And I've given you $50,000 and I made a $100,000 donation. So we're not having this conversation. Are we clear? And that to us seemed like such a dangerous extension of what had been happening inside the homes when we were nannies. It was one thing to be treating everyone inside your home that way, but to see that happening on the institutional level, because it meant no one was going to put these parents in check. And that seems psychologically so dangerous for the children. And it is. I mean, I think that we can see what happens to these kids now. The college cheating scandal, right? Just at what point are you responsible for yourself? At what point do you succeed and fail on your own merit? So those were all the things that we were obsessed with.
When did the idea to have a now 16-year-old drunken grayer come knocking on the door in the middle of the night for answers after he sees that infamous nanny cam, did that come to you all early on or nearer to the end?
Emma wrote that scene. As I said, she has always been grayer, and she just had a really clear vision of it. She felt, again, that felt sense. She just knew that this is what would happen. And I think we had been reluctant to go back there or to move into the future because we weren't sure what was going to happen for Greer. But I think that we found a way to come back into the family, even though it's certainly not the happy ending that people had hoped for at the end of the first book, and still find a way through and forward for Greer, where we can leave him feeling like he's going to be able to move into adulthood on a sure footing. I mean, I think that we don't really know what Mrs. X is going to take away from the end of the first book. So in a way, by revisiting the character, we're able to leave him in a much better place at the end of the second book, because he's finally gotten, Nanny got to say her piece at the end of the first book. Greer gets to say his piece by the end of the second. And that, I think, is what our hearts have been missing.
And were you too happy with where Nan wound up as a mother in her own right by the end of the sequel?
I think we were working through our own PTSD around having children. Honestly, I remember standing on Park Avenue as I walked home from my very last day of childcare and saying, 10 years. I was like Scarlett O'Hara with the carrot. God is my witness. 10 years I need before I can even think about having my own kids. And to this day, I sometimes think that other people's children got the best parenting I had to give. It was heartbreaking. It was absolutely heartbreaking. And to get to a place where we could really be convinced that we would be able to do it to the standard to which we'd held ourselves publicly, that took some time. And Nanny's working through that. She doesn't know. She's waiting to be convinced that she'll be able to do it differently.
I imagine there must have been a sense of closure by the end of the second book when you were both like, we can move on with the rest of our lives now that this is bookended properly.
We did. And also I was 9 months pregnant when it came out. So it did feel like, okay, that was 10 years. And now let's start this new project and this new phase. So it was bookended nicely.
Following that franchise's completion, we continue to see strong female protagonists in future bestsellers like The Real Real and Over You. Out of curiosity, what were some of the fundamentals that consistently wove their way throughout each of these different characters at core?
Emma once said, the through line for all our female characters is that they live by the credo, I am not the asshole, you are the asshole. And I think that is true, even though they're always put in really morally challenging, ethically challenging situations, seductive situations where it would be very easy not to do the right thing. They are determined to try to find a way through that they can live with in their stomach. And we're really interested in just surviving. I think so many of the things that we talked about were, when we were wanting to write about nannying, the industry thought that was a really ridiculous topic. And then it was proven there was merit in that conversation. And we spent 10 years writing books about young women in situations that were ooky. And then the Me Too movement happened. And we're like, yeah, see, there is a conversation to be had here. Between you and me, we started writing that book right after my daughter was born. So 12 years ago, because we thought it was really strange that Britney Spears was in a conservatorship kept by her father. We looked up the legal requirements for a conservatorship. You have to be able to neither feed, house, or clothe yourself. So she doesn't meet the legal criteria. How is this happening? So we started doing research. And again, our publisher was like, why do you care about this? And so we've been proven right again and again in terms of our instincts about what it is to be a young woman. There's a lot of victimization. And yet I don't think any of these characters see themselves as victims. They just see themselves as someone trying to put one foot in front of the other. And isn't that so much more interesting than trying to get the guy or going shopping? So much more interesting.
I bet The First Affair was a fun one to write, with Jamie McAllister and President Gregory Russlin. He sounds like just the kind of sleazy politician that would prey on a White House intern.
Well, we had long been obsessed with Monica Lewinsky for all the same reasons that everyone is now obsessed with Monica Lewinsky, going all the way back to the first round. We just remembered being, young women, very close to her in age, thinking, I don't know that I would have done anything differently. And it seems like everyone's coming after her and sort of letting him off. And as the years went by and we'd hear sort of little snippets about her socially, we thought, this is just wrong. It's just wrong. And so we wanted to write a story about a young woman just to remind people. And again, there's been so much revision that's happened since The First Affair came out. But when Emma and I were starting to talk about this, people would look at us like we were crazy. We're like, no, you don't remember. the facts were so warped in how they were presented. And she was so young. She was 19. She was 19. And then when we looked back at her family history, her father had left her mother for a mistress. And that was fully told to her at the age of 13. So of course she was someone who grew up to become obsessed with the ites. The other woman wins. The other woman gets dad. And he was so psychologically arrested. So all of those ingredients were so fascinating to us that we wanted to revisit the idea of that story and fictionalize it and examine what it is when a young woman puts her trust in the wrong people.
So Close was a different sort of book for you and Emma to write, more of a straight ahead romance almost. What was the tie in, if at all, thematically to the previous two?
So Close was really the third installment of a trilogy. There was Between You and Me, Brittany, First Affair, Monica, and then we were really interested in the John Edwards scandal. We were interested in the idea of this couple who agreed to put this man's mistress up in their home, and then it ruins their lives when they just think they're trying to do the right thing. And so we wanted to place this young woman inside of the eye of the storm of politics, because Emma and I were both starting to feel by that point in our lives, it seemed that no matter how well intentioned someone went into the machine itself, the level of attention and adulation just seemed to warp people. Men seemed to warp men. And that they would sort of come out the other side with a sense of entitlement that is really contradictory to the idea of being a public servant. Servant parts seem to have fallen away. So those were all the things that we got to explore through the character of Mandy, she's just a rock star. She's just a badass from a trailer park in Central Florida who ends up in the White House.
You and Emma are just hysterical on the page, no matter what you're writing about. How to Be a Grown-Up would be a great example of that. Do you two crack each other up a lot as you're writing back and forth?
Oh, thank you. How to Be a Grown-Up, which was the last book that we wrote together, was probably our most fun. We were in our 40s. We were so confident at that point. This is what we have to say. And I think we also had an inkling that it was the last book that we were going to write together. And so we just wanted to, leave it all on the table about what it is as a woman, a Gen X woman who came of age with one set of expectations and has arrived here. I think if they call our grandparents the greatest generation, we are going to be the screwed over generation. We're the unsung generation. Every awful thing has happened to us, but not at a 10, at like a 5. And we've just quietly endured, and there's no parade for us. And that's kind of what How to Be a Grown-Up is about. Also a woman who married her high school crush, that guy who was on the cover of Tiger Beat, and she meets him in college and thinks that she's about to go off and have this extraordinary life as the wife of a superstar. And he just never quite finds his footing in his 20s until she gets to this point in her marriage where she realizes she's having to adult for 2 people and 2 small children. And what does that mean? And it was also a sort of a last chance to satirize Condé Nast and Hearst as they were imploding, which was a fascinating thing to watch happen to our friends.
Before we go, what can fans look forward to getting their hands on next from you as a solo novelist?
So when Emma and I separated professionally, not personally, we talk every day, she was so done with the entertainment industry, she could hardly breathe, like just done. And I wanted to be able to get back to the kind of writing that I had done on my own before she and I had started collaborating. And we both deeply believe in entertainment. There was a great piece that Stephen King wrote about how Amy Tan had been hurt by some of her coverage. And she said, I just want them to know I care about the words. And I think that frequently happens for people who work in commercial fiction, because we worship the altar of plot and pacing, and I want you to have a really good time. I want you to laugh and I want you to cry. But I also deeply care about the words, and there were long passages that I wrote in all of our books that I ended up voluntarily cutting because they just didn't belong. they were distracting. And so I wanted to have an opportunity to do something entirely about the words. And so I've done two things that are very different. One is sort of not that at all, because it's almost no words, but it's a graphic novel called The 29ers. And the publishing company that's doing it will be launching a Kickstarter in the next couple of weeks to finish out the last 12 pages for the colorist and the letterist and the illustrator and all that. But it's super cool. It's YA sci-fi. It's about a group of teenagers who survive when 99.99% of the human race goes inanimate, and they go on a quest to restart the world. And what I love, love, love about this genre versus the things that Emma and I tried to get made in our 30s is that there is no cost to executing any of my vision. So if I want to blow up the Brooklyn Bridge, it costs exactly the same as drawing a panel of two people talking. So I get to do all the big, violent, gory action sequences that are near and dear to my heart, and people don't know that about me. So it's been super, super, super fun. I love it. And then I wrote a novel called The Scale of Permanence, which my agent was just emailing me about. It took me forever. I mean, certain stops and starts. The pandemic. There was a year, but it is finally going out to editors for sale. So I will keep you posted about that. But it is a multi-generational story about how the effects of abuse trickle down through the generations and what it is to try to find healing and redemption and forgiveness.
Nicola, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being on About the Authors TV.
Thank you. It was really fun.